Great. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for coming out tonight. We appreciate you being part of this second in a series called The Challenges and Opportunities of Police Reform. And in our first session, which by the way was recorded, and if you missed it, you do have the opportunity to go back and watch it, and I would highly recommend that. We had the opportunity to speak with Desmon Yancy, who I'll reintroduce to you again, who was born and raised on Chicago's South Side, is director of community organizing with Inner City Muslims Action Network, community organization that fosters health, wellness, and healing by organizing for social change, cultivating the arts, and operating a holistic health center. Desmon has been a key advisor to the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, called GAPA, and the Coalition for Police Contract Accountability. He's a longtime labor and community organizer who has trained hundreds of leaders to fight for dignity and respect in their workplace and neighborhoods, police accountability, and racial justice. He has held a number of leadership positions in his storied career, and we welcome you again, Desmon. And also we heard from Adam Gross, who is Director of Police Accountability at Business and Professional People for the Public Interest, better known as a BPI, a law and policy center focused on racial equity, urban poverty, and social justice. Since 2016, Adam has worked with the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, again with Desmon, a coalition of community organizations working to create a community-driven police oversight and accountability system. Adam worked with the Police Accountability Task Force. I had a chance to work with him and help develop the task force key proposals for structural reform. Previously at BPI, Adam has led efforts to craft and enact laws and policies to transform the juvenile justice system, create and preserve affordable housing, and stabilize and strengthen neighborhoods. Welcome, Adam. I'm glad you're here tonight. And so in our session last time, Desmon and Adam spoke about their ideas about the need for police reform and some of the ideas that would bring us to that place. Tonight, we are also inviting to be part of our panel two people who have careers or have had careers in law enforcement. And I should have mentioned, by the way, in Desmond's introduction, that his family has been part of the Chicago Police Department over a period of generations. So we want to acknowledge that as well. But I want to introduce you to Tamara Margolis, who has over 22 years of law enforcement experience. She's presently serving as lieutenant in the Chicago Police Department and is serving her second term as president of the Shomrim Society of Illinois, an organization.
There have been a lot of questions.
I don't know where that came from.
Okay. Well, there have been a lot of questions, and we're going to get to them. She's president of the Shomrim Society, the second term president of the Shomrim Society of Illinois, an organization of Jewish first responders. And Tamara holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Police Administration from Michigan State University, and most notably has been a member of the Anshe Synagogue community for about 20 years. I should also mention that Adam grew up here. And I also want to underscore the fact that we're thrilled that Tamara is joining us this evening, but also to note that she is not here representing the Chicago Police Department. The views that she will express tonight are her own. And so let's just underscore that. And again, thank you, Tamara, for joining us. And finally, Matt Tobias, who is well known to all of us as well, and does a wonderful job as the Director of Security of Anshe and Bernard Zell Anshe Day School. He is a retired Deputy Chief of the Chicago Police Department. Matt has been deeply involved in the training of Chicago police officers and has also a great deal of experience on SWAT teams. And he oversaw the security of the 2012 NATO summit in Chicago in 2012. Matt, along with his father and sons, have also all proudly served our country in the Marine Corps. We thank you all for your service as well. So thanks so much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
I want to begin just with a Hebrew word. Matt, in our discussion before the call began, or this meeting began, used the word kavod, and which means honor, and that he associates that word with Bernard Zell. In the official name of Anshe Emet, we have the word Emet. Anshe Emet really means people of truth. And the word Emet is an interesting one because it's made up of the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, Mem, the middle letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and Taf, the final letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And it is a reminder of the expansive nature of truth. There is not one truth. And truth is varied, and truth has depth and nuance. And so we are part of a great tradition that brings together differing views in order for us to further our understanding and further our quest for deeper truths. The people on this panel are thoughtful and they are deeply committed to the work. And we are really honored to have them as we begin this conversation. The way that the evening will be structured is as follows. We're going to spend the first 20 to 30 minutes talking with Matt and Tamara. They listened to the last session, and we wanted to give them an opportunity to respond to some of the things that they heard. And then after that, this first part, we're going to then bring Adam and Desmon into the conversation to discuss not only what they've heard, but also to spend some time thinking about where they agree. And finally, we're going to open up for questions. And please remember that all questions can be put into the chat, and I'll be monitoring that as we go through the evening. So let's begin. And again, thank you for joining us this evening. I'm going to ask a question outside of last session. How are you feeling right now as a police officer and a security professional during this time? What's the morale of your fellow officers, Tamara? And what are you seeing, Matt? Let's start with that.
If I'm going first, thank you, Rabbi, for allowing me to participate in this conversation. It's so very important. You ask of the morale. I can speak for myself, and what I can see is, and with some of the other officers in the profession, is that morale is definitely not as high as we would like it to be, understandably so. We are professionals who have dedicated our lives to serving others and have seen ourselves as helping, the helpers. And unfortunately, with a few officers who have made unfortunate decisions that have cost others their lives, that all officers are now being painted with that same brush. And my concern is for the officers' personal well-being and to be able to get back to that place where they can be seen as the hero, which is what they are.
And I'll follow up on that if I could. When you ask a police academy class, when you ask the young men and women who've joined a police department why they became police officers, invariably they will say to help people. And so many times people just brush that off as, oh, you gave the easy answer. And it's not just the easy answer. It's in in the majority of the cases, the truth. They feel a strong need strong desire to help communities and to help other people. And just as Tamara pointed out, when that's part of who they are and what's made them up as who they are as police officers, as citizens, because of course they came from the community, to then be cast in that broad brushstroke for the actions of the few.
Mm-hmm.
And I do understand, people will argue it's more than just a few. Okay. And we are talking about hundreds of thousands of encounters every single year. So we see it as the few, but all of a sudden when you're vilified and told that you're now something that you aren't, that you're not, that's very disheartening, and it impacts morale significantly. And that's where we're seeing many people leaving the profession because they have enough time on the job and they can retire, or not coming into the profession. And that's a huge problem, because there are some tremendous young men and women who are ready to be the police, but have now decided, no, I don't want to be painted like that. But yeah, so morale, I have the freedom of speaking freely because I'm retired. And I would say that morale is nationwide the lowest I have ever seen it.
Mm. And yet, this week, we commemorated the first anniversary of the murder of George Floyd under the knee of a police officer. And this country also commemorated the 100th anniversary of the massacre in Tulsa, which we want to note was witnessed by police without acting to protect its citizenry. So let's begin with this question. Do you think that, and I'm directing this to Matt and Tamara, do you think that this, the issue of police reform is either unfair or overblown?
I would say no, it's not unfair. It can be applied unfairly. We can put blame on individuals or on the profession as a whole. When things have been in place for years and officers are doing what they've been trained to do, or feel they've been trained to do, and what they've been instructed to do. So it's not unfair, and it's necessary. It's constantly necessary. Strive for continuous improvement is what I always felt. So I don't have an issue with police reform, but what does that mean? What is the new, what are the nuances there? So it's not unfair, and it's not unnecessary. It is necessary. And until we can get to a place where everybody in society feels that policing is equitable and valuing all citizens and treating everybody fairly, then we have work to do. So I'm all for that.
What about you, Tamara?
I would echo Matt's response. It's not unfair to expect reform and to expect change. We always have to evolve, and the goal is always to do better. And this gives us an opportunity to take a hard look at what we're doing. And I'm thankful for this communication, because we have to listen with open ears to take a hard look at what we're doing and understand where others may not agree with how we're doing things, and be open to the possibility of change. And change sometimes is hard and slow, and in a large community such as this.
So when you were listening to the last session, to Desmon and to Adam, who have devoted yo person's time to this issue, hundreds, if not thousands of hours on these issues and have, worked to bring these issues to light and to offer what they believe are sensible reforms. Matt, how did you respond to that?
I rather enjoyed hearing what they had to say. It's good for me to hear different views. If all that I listen to is people that agree with me, I'm certainly not going to evolve. I'm certainly not going to grow. And I enjoyed, and I if I didn't say it last week, I want to say it again. I commend Anshe, Emet, and you, Rabbi, for having these tough conversations, because these are not comfortable. They are challenging, and we're talking about human beings here, and we are, I don't know of any perfect human being, but these are challenging conversations, and hearing what they had to say was very good. And as I said last week, was very enlightening that 70%, that was just a number I picked out of my head, we could agree upon. And it's the other 30%, and it may be 75 or 80, whatever. You get the idea. Right. So it was very good for me to hear them, and I appreciated being invited to be part of the conversation last week, listening, and this week to speak.
So tomorrow, in our last session, we spent a lot of time talking about the issue of trust and the breakdown of trust between the police and the citizenry. Right. And for both Desmon and for Adam, this was a key issue that needs to be addressed. How do you respond to that, and how do you understand the breakdown of trust, and how do you believe that we can begin rebuilding it?
That is a multi-layered question.
Yep.
With trust. It's difficult, and I think Chicago is a large city. We have different ethnic groups in different areas, and sometimes they're very divided and sometimes they're very close together. And each community sometimes has their unique experience in interactions with police officers. And we as a community realize.
But you're in Bronzeville. You're in Bronzeville, right?
Yes, I am in Bronzeville and Hyde Park.
So let's talk about that, and let's talk about how you understand it from your vantage point.
From my vantage point is the way for policing to be successful is to have that trust and partnership with the community. Without that, we can't succeed. And it is so important for the citizens who we serve to know that if they call for help, that we are there to help them, and that they can trust us, and that we will be empowered to make the right decisions for them.
Right. But presently, do you think that exists?
I don't think that exists where we would like it to be.
Yeah. So Matt, how do you get there? How when you were listening to Desmond and to Adam last time talk about this, how do you rebuild trust? And how do we do that? They were talking in terms of ensuring, one of the things that was ensuring that, people of color are Black and Hispanic policemen are serving their communities, that would also be an important piece of the puzzle. And presently, the minorities are not well represented in the Chicago Police Department. So talk a little bit about how you think that we repair that. You have the advantage of not being, in the midst of it. You can kind of view it from afar, but I think your perspective is a valuable one.
Thank you. Trust is the issue. It's the most important issue. In any relationship, you have to have trust. And certainly it's a relationship between the police and the public. But again, as I said, where did the police come from? I wasn't born a police officer. I didn't have a little blue star on me when I was born. I grew up, and later I came the police, actually quite by accident. I had no intention of being a police officer, but we come from the
So wait,
community.
you didn't get into rabbinical school? Was that the problem?
No, as I mentioned, I almost went to law school.
Onward.
Trust is the most important thing to me. Developing relationships and building those relationships. When I was a patrolman way back when, I like to get out of the car. My partner and I like to get out of the car. And if you can't tell, I'm a people person. I like people, and getting out and talking to people and learning the community. I love the idea of the old-fashioned beat officer who knew everybody, who knew the stores, who knew the kids, who knew the parents because he knew them when they were kids, and now they're the parents in the community, or she. And what we got away from was that CAPS brought that back. I really enjoyed CAPS from that aspect, because it helped to humanize, and it forced police officers and the community to do things together, which humanized both of them and tried to tear down this us versus them, because that's just not a healthy thing. But doing things together, and for people to understand that the officer is a father, a brother, an active member in his own community or in that community. All those humanizing things help to build the trust. And there's many other things that help to build trust. One must prove themselves to be trustworthy in order to be trusted, is a saying that I learned a long time ago and believe in. So we should be looking at everything that we can do to build trust. And the thing that concerns me is part of that is transparency. And just as before I got off the Chicago Police Department in 2012, we were really pushing the in-car camera. And officers were quite afraid. Some officers were quite afraid of that, of what it would video. And I would tell them more often than not, it's going to save your career. And if you're worried about something that's going to be caught on camera, then maybe that's something you shouldn't be doing. So change your ways. So that's a good thing for that camera to be there. Now we have much more body camera, and it's going to show the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it's going to show the messiness of policing. Policing is not clean. Nice encounters are, but heated domestics, heated mental health issues, gang crimes type issues, all those things are not pretty. And when it's caught on the film, on the body camera, and then taken out of context, or only certain snippets are shown, what does that do to trust? And actually, I meant to ask the question last week. I thought of it afterwards. What role does the media play in building that trust? And I'll tell you, I feel, and many police officers feel, that sometimes they're there to throw fuel on the fire instead of getting to the truth or showing the full picture. Mm-hmm. So it makes it hard for people to be transparent when they are transparent, and then it's used against them.
Well, let me pick up on that, because you were talking about the messiness of police work and the heart, and there are difficult sides to watch in order for people to be protected. But one of the things that we spoke about in our last session was whether police should be brought into the kinds of cases they're brought into now. Should police be brought into domestic issues or drug issues or mental illness? Is there a need for a more diversified force, if you will, not just of police, but social workers, et cetera? How do you respond to that, Tamara? Because that was a large part of our conversation last time.
It's very broad. Can you focus that question for me?
Sure. What I'm saying, one of the things that that was brought up at our last session was that police, when you dial 911, right? The people who are going to be sent in are the police, right? And whether it's a domestic issue, a drug issue, mental illness issues, and they may not be the best people to handle that situation. And we've seen some really ugly moments when people didn't handle things the way that we would have wanted. So the question is, in conversations about police reform, where who should be part of the police force, and do we go beyond police officers? There's a conversation about whether or not policemen should be doing traffic violations, right? I mean, that's a question out there. How do you respond to that?
How do I respond? In the course of 22 years being a law enforcement officer in the city, my role has changed over the years, from a patrolman to a supervisor. There was a time where mental health was offered, and there were clinics in the city of Chicago that offered mental health treatment to individuals. And we as officers did not receive crisis intervention training early on. I was part of the initial class in 2004 that received the crisis intervention training to give us the ability to better respond to those in mental health crisis. And it was fantastic training. That training is continuing now. So the idea is for all officers to obtain that training. Unfortunately, decisions were made by organizations other than the police department to shut down some of those facilities that were helping the community dealing with their mental health issues. And then, unfortunately, it fell upon the police officers to respond to these crises in a way that law enforcement professionals would respond. We would respond, we see violence, and we would work to combat that violence and control the situation. Fortunately, now we are receiving much better training in understanding how to assess the situation and how to de-escalate. So, and see the signs of a person going through mental stress and trauma, and have an understanding that it isn't an individual who is purposely defying us or purposely not listening to our instructions, but they are incapable at the time of doing that. When a person is in crisis, they are not thinking logically. And it's actually great to see that the department is, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the department, I have to be careful to say that, that we are all educating ourselves on how to better respond to these crisis situations so that we're not forced to make a decision that none of us want to make. We don't want to be placed in that situation where we might have to use deadly force because we were unable to control the situation enough to de-escalate it and bring it down. And so that's what we are working on to train ourselves to better serve the community. And I think that also leads into this idea of defunding the police, also with body-worn cameras, with responsibility, because there actually needs to be more funding for police in order to effectively have progressive quality reform. Mm-hmm. Because we need to train our officers in order to respond to these new situations that we weren't exposed to before. Also, I know we'll get into this topic later, but there's this new foot pursuit policy. It is intrinsic for a police officer in the belief that you need to catch the bad guy. That's what we are there for. We need to catch the bad guy, and it will be a change for us in how we perceive that and how our role changes when we have to give more consideration about when we engage. Right. I believe that's kind of a broad response, but there's just so much to talk about.
Absolutely. I just want to note that, and then I'm going to bring Adam and Desmon into the conversation. Now, this morning's Wall Street Journal, there was a piece that said that, and I'm quoting, 1 year after the movement to defund law enforcement began to upend municipal budgets, many American cities are restoring money to their police departments or proposing to spend more in light of the rise in crime. And they gave the numbers in New York City and Baltimore, et cetera. So this conversation is very alive right now as to what this means and how will this affect crime, and how do we maintain a safe and orderly society. So before we talk about what we agree on, I'm going to give Desmond and Adam a chance to respond to what they've been hearing in this conversation. Desmond, I'll start with you. You have to unmute yourself, please, gentlemen.
Yeah, sure. Again, thank you all for being so courageous to have these conversations. As Rabbi mentioned earlier, it's these aren't easy conversations, or maybe it was Matthew. These aren't easy conversations to have, but they are important ones to have. So I want to thank you for that. Yeah, just in response to some of what was said, I'm in agreement with most of it. I think there's this this notion of I can't understand why police across the country feel vilified by the media and these sort of high-profile incidents that have shown up. But one of the things that I struggle with is, though they are the actions of the many, they're often witnessed and the actions of the few, they're often witnessed and covered up by the many. And this goes to the point of transparency, where when I don't doubt that the majority of police officers are good police officers in the sense of black and white, good and bad, right? But what I struggle with is this notion that that the community just doesn't understand policing, or that that some officers are unwilling to understand what the community outcry is about and why we want to have these conversations about reform. I've been working for 35 years or so now, and I've had oversight every step of the way in my career. No one is above that sort of oversight. And I think that if it's going to bring public safety, right, if it's going to make people in this city feel better, also understanding that, some 60% of the city of Chicago is either Black or Latino. It's a huge chunk of the population that feels the need to build or rebuild this trust, depending on your perspective. There's this other notion of police officers being uncomfortable being painted with broad brushes, but that's often what happens in the Black community when we have these conversations about policing. And it's, it's often like I struggle when a police officer comes to my car with his hand on his gun, right? Yet, we hear all the time, traffic stops are very dangerous and we don't know what we're going to come into. But I'm a 50-year-old Black dude with a 7-year-old son who, just wants to go home every night, just like those officers do. But we don't often get the benefit of the doubt. And so when officers come into these very tense and dangerous situations, the tunnel vision kicks in, and the things that you see and believe, your own experiences, your own environment, your regular environment, helps shape how you react in those experiences. And to a point that Matthew made, some of this is just what people are trained to do. How do we talk about how to make that training look differently so that there is more confidence and so that officers are safe? Again, my dad was a police officer for nearly 40 years. I have cousins and brother-in-laws who've been in law enforcement leadership. And, by the grace of God, none of them have had any issues that have made it to the news, and frankly, have all come home every night. So how do we make sure that that's safe for all people in the city, not just officers?
Adam, what would you add?
At first, I'd echo Desmond. Thank you to you, Rabbi Siegel, for organizing and creating this opportunity. And thank you to Tamara and to Matt for engaging in these conversations. They're, as Desmond said, as we've all said, they're hard conversations. They're essential conversations. We need many, many more of them. And I love that some of what we're talking about is the many, many things that we agree on. There was lots that Tamara and Matt said that really resonated. Thinking about a little bit of what Matt said when he was talking about how he really likes to get out of the car, and the opportunities that that creates for engagement and breaking down barriers and humanizing. And it reminded me that when we have conversations like this, it's really important to say, I think these conversations are not so much about the behavior of individual officers, but about larger systems and how they operate. I assume, so one thing we know for a fact, all police officers are human beings. I don't think police officers are any different than any other human beings. I don't think that the police department is any more or less racist than any other place in society. I don't think police officers are any smarter or less smart than anybody else, any better or less good than anybody else. And the conversations that we have about policing, I believe, really need to emphasize the systems in which those officers work. So to go to Matt's point about being out on the street, not in the car, I think we've known for a very long time that having officers out on the street helps to create the kinds of relationships we need. We have built a policing system which has made it harder and harder for police officers to get out of their cars. They're spending more and more time today than they have in the past, driving from place to place without those opportunities to get out and make connections. That has nothing to do with the goodness of that officer, and it makes it more challenging for an officer who wants to do all the things that Matt described, to build those connections, to engage with and help create community. So these questions are all, in my mind, ultimately about what are the systems producing, and how do we create an environment in which police officers can do their best in precisely the way Matt described. Tamara talked as well about some of the significant improvements that have been made in policing over the last 20 years. As she said, there was a long time when police officers got no training in how to engage with people who are in mental health crisis, and a bunch of years that was something was put in place, and now it's mandated for all officers, and the requirements are much more substantial than they were in the past. So it's not surprising that for a long time we've had a lot of challenging situations with police officers engaging with people in mental health crisis, because police officers weren't given the training they needed to deal with those situations. And what makes sense when engaging with someone who is not in mental health crisis is often the opposite of what makes sense when engaging with someone who is in mental health crisis. So again, it's about looking at those kinds of systems, how to help police officers to do the best possible job to serve community the way that they want to serve, and the way that communities hope to be served. Tamara also talked about de-escalation. Again, absolutely essential to train officers to go into situations that we know will be tense, and to have the mental tools to take a tense situation and make it less tense without having to use force. For a long time, police officers received little or no training in de-escalation. Those requirements have been ramped up significantly, and I think probably need to be ramped up even more, and need to continue throughout a police officer's career, not just when they're in the academy beforehand. Lots of us work in professions where there are ongoing requirements for professional training, and as we learn more and more about how to do these things well, police officers should be given the resources so that they can improve.
So Adam, and Desmond, let me circle back for a second, because when I asked the question about whether or not police officers should be the ones to go into those situations, Tamara said, well, her response was that the training has improved greatly, right? But is that, in your mind, is that enough? should police officers be in those situations as a matter of course?
Sorry, you're directing that to me, Rabbi?
Either you or Desmond.
I can take a first crack at it. I think it's hard to generalize. Every situation is going to be different. One of the challenges is, oftentimes a call goes into 911 and the dispatcher at 911 doesn't know exactly what's happening. You get a description from someone who might be very frightened, who might be witnessing something from a distance, who doesn't have perfect information, and they need to make some judgment about who to send out. So increasing training in the way that Tamara described is absolutely essential, because there will for sure be situations in which police officers are going out into those situations, and better that they have the best possible training to handle those situations. We need to do a better job of trying to determine as best as we can before sending someone out onto the scene, who's the best person or who are the best people to send out. Chicago's doing some encouraging work now, catching up with some other cities around the country, looking at what's often described as a co-responder model, which means in situations where there's good evidence that what you're dealing with is someone in mental health crisis, that you send out not just a police officer, but someone who has even more training than a police officer will ever have in dealing with people in mental health crisis. And it may be the person who has that highly specialized training who makes the initial contact, but the police officer is there, maybe initially in the background, in case things get more dangerous. And we need to be exploring other models like that in other situations to protect civilians, to protect police officers, and to make certain that we're all working together as best as possible to protect communities and make and keep people healthy.
Do you want to add anything, Desmond?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree with that. Like, when you're thinking about tools for jobs, you use a hammer for a nail and a screwdriver for a screw. If you use a hammer as a screwdriver, somebody's going to get hurt, right? So it's absolutely important to make sure that we're sending the right resources to the right people, especially when they're in need.
So Matt or Tamara, how do you respond to that? I mean, is this unrealistic, or what are you hearing and what are you thinking as this is suggested?
Sure. I was about to say earlier, and Desmond took the word out of my mouth, the words out of my mouth. If you give a man a hammer, everything becomes a nail. So you've got to give the individual, you got to give the officer more tools, because if all that you give him is these tools, well, then I know how to solve the problem, and that's not. Tamara touched on defunding the police and touched on the CIT training, which is fantastic training. It's great training. And they're given skills where it's not unnatural for a police officer, especially a less experienced police officer, that when they instruct an individual to do something and they don't comply with that lawful order, which is what people are supposed to do. That's the way the laws are written. You should comply with the lawful order. Well, when they lack the ability, because they're in a mental health crisis mode, for the officer to recognize that, as Tamara pointed out, they're not disobeying you. They're just, because of the situation, because of the mental health crisis that they're in, they're incapable of at that moment. So it's not an affront to you, officer. It's the state that they're in. And for the officer to understand that, that's another tool that now they have. So they don't just have the hammer, they also have let's say the soft glove, okay? To be able to understand that it's not personal, it's not an affront to you, it's not challenging your authority, it's something else. I don't know of a single police officer, I've never met a police officer who says, oh good, I just got another domestic violence call, or I just got another mental health call. trust me, the police don't want to go to those. But as Tamara also pointed out, when we cut back funding or when we don't have enough funding for other things like mental health centers, who do you call? I remember being called as a young patrolman to an incident where a mother told me to tell her daughter to do her homework. What? I'm here to tell her to do her homework. Okay. When people don't know who to call, I'll call 911 and the police come, and police get thrown into all kinds of situations that, trust me, they don't want to. So what does this mean? This means that we need to give more training to the police. We need to give them more tools, but we also need things that are going to help the public, help individuals to cope, be it parent training, be it mental health centers, be it whatever. It's so much bigger than just policing. And we get thrown in, police officers get thrown into these things and try to figure it out. And unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't come out so good. And that's no good for anybody.
Yeah. I know we were talking about things that you agree on, but I also want to point out some things that you don't agree on. So in our initial conversation, we talked about the Adam Toledo case. It was very clear, both from Adam and from Desmon, that that this was handled by the officer in a poor way. And we had a conversation about the shot spotter technology as well in that conversation. Yesterday, when we were preparing together, it was clear that both Matt and Tamara had very different views of what had happened in that moment. And I want to open that up so that you can, for the four of you, to discuss this in the way that I was privileged to hear that conversation as well, because I think this is really, really important. I'm going to look to you, Matt, because you spoke about it first.
So again, where I said it was good for me to be there to the last conversation to hear things that I don't normally hear, I had never heard of an issue with ShotSpotter. We being the police didn't invent it. It was brought to us as a strategy to help communities when there are shots being fired by a gun. And for those that don't understand what ShotSpotter is, essentially what it is it's a bunch of listening. It's a bunch of microphones that are out there to pick up the sound, the wavelength of a gunshot. And if they're in enough locations, it triangulates, and it then, before the citizens call in, or even simultaneously, tells the officer where shots were just fired. So someone needs help because someone's shooting a gun. We shouldn't be shooting guns in the city of Chicago or any other city. So I always thought of ShotSpotter as a good thing, helping us to get there. And I don't mean to put words in your mouth, Desmond, and I'm certainly not attacking you, but it sounded to me like you said that had the ability to cause confrontations. Did I hear that right? And if I didn't, please correct me. That ShotSpotter was bringing officers into more confrontations, and therefore then that was bad. That's making it sound like the ShotSpotter caused a negative interaction between the police and the public. No, it's more proximity than causation. The ShotSpotter was there. What the real cause was someone shot a gun, and they're either shooting at people or they're just shooting it off. And the police are responding in the hopes of capturing an individual who has committed a crime, a violent crime. And I thought that was a good thing. But please, Desmond, if I said it wrong, can you tell me if I heard that wrong? Or
yeah, I'll try to clean up what I said. Maybe I said it wrong. There was a couple things that came out like right before we met, and I'm just was running a quick Google search. It was May 3rd when there was an article or there was big press, Sun-Times, Trib, Fox 32 about ShotSpotter and how it is seemingly ineffective. And what the statement was, just lost it, is that ShotSpotter, the system which the business says detects, this is a quote from the article, which the business says detects gunshots with 97% accuracy, sent officers on an average of 61 dead-end searches per day, possibly because it doesn't accurately distinguish between shots and other loud noises such as firecrackers and backfiring cars. And so what I was suggesting was that because of the inaccuracy of the ShotSpotter system, that it sends officers into tough situations with a sort of a heightened sense. Mm-hmm. And that is the sort of stuff that contributes to the very tense moments with people in the community.
I see what you're saying, in that in the mind of the officer, what they're perceiving is that they're going into a situation where there were shots fired, and therefore they're coming in a very heightened state, maybe adrenaline's pumping, and that they're thinking they're going into a potentially deadly force situation. But because of the inaccuracy of the system to differentiate between a backfiring car or a firecracker, now you got officers coming in up here in a situation that didn't call for it at all.
Right. Just a bit more from the article. This is actually in response to a lawsuit that was filed against the company that has the system. It says residents who happen to be in the vicinity of a false alert will be regarded as presumptive threats, likely be targeted by police for investigatory stops, foot pursuits, or even worse. And so again, it's, how do we make sure that there's a system that allows for police officers to be as safe as possible, right? Like, I think the danger that is equated with a police officer acting in an emergency situation isn't much different than, or is as dangerous as a fireman going into a fire, right? So how are we but the difference is a fire is a fight back in that sort of way, right? It's not a person, it's an inanimate object. But how are we making sure that that the officers are safe, that community members are safe? If this is a situation where someone has been shooting and causing unsafe situations for people in the community, I don't think I can make an argument against police officers responding to that. But it's when folks are coming in, I'm going to show my age with this, but police academy, Tackleberry kind of attitude, right? Like, it's like, I'm here, somebody's going to get it. And then you've got folks pumped up. And this is a general overgeneralization probably, but these sorts of things do happen. And oftentimes those outcomes are not favorable for the people in the community.
So Tamara, where do you come out in this?
Listening to the different perspectives and the idea that the ShotSpotter would be giving officers, Desmond, I'm trying to make sure I repeat what you said correctly from the study, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that it would be amping up the officer's response to expect to be placed into a situation where they may have to use force. From experience with ShotSpotter in the district, and every night there's a ShotSpotter incident, is that it's not the only tool that officers use to respond to these situations, because ShotSpotter sometimes is inaccurate, but most times it is accurate. And we also rely on citizens calling in 911 to document that a call of shots fired. And so I see it more as a tool for us to be able to get to the location faster than the amount of time it takes for a person to hear gunshots, determine if they want to call 911, get through, and then have the call taker take it, send it to the dispatcher, and have it dispatched to an officer. And when someone is injured or hurt, or could potentially be injured or hurt, seconds matter. They really do. And so ShotSpotter is really essential to help us render aid faster if someone is a victim, and make sure that EMS is called, or if it is not accurate, that we can quickly investigate and determine that it's not valid, and help people that way. pretty much everything. It's a totality of circumstances when ShotSpotter is brought into it. It's not the only piece of information that we use when we respond to a certain incident. Unfortunately, there are a lot more people with guns in the city that we would like. And oftentimes they decide to shoot them off because they just want to shoot them. Oftentimes they shoot them in the air and then they go back in their house and there's no witnesses.
Yeah, I can understand that, but this is just from the data related to this lawsuit. And it says that over a 22-month period ending in mid-April this year, almost 90% of ShotSpotter alerts didn't result in officers reporting any evidence of shots fired or any gun crime. The technology is only used in 12 police districts with the city's largest proportion of Black and Latino residents, which the group says inflates statistics about supposed gunfire in these communities, creating a faulty tech-based justification for even more aggressive policing. So like two sides of the coin. I understand that there are moments where this technology saves lives, but there are a lot of moments where it doesn't. Is there something that is more efficient or some other system like, I don't know, increase trust and transparency between the police department and the community so that when people have these issues, they call 911. And I'm not knocking the tools, but it's a reevaluation of the tools. So for example, I read something today that talked about field drug testing kits and how there are lawsuits that have shown that field drug testing kits have tested positive for drugs and donut icing, drywall, air, water, bird poop, right? And just recently there was a lawsuit that was filed because a gentleman in Springfield, police detained him, went through his car, found a container, said the container contained meth and it contained the ashes of his 2-year-old daughter who died, right? And so he was detained, arrested, got his father on the phone, and his father pleaded with the police and was able, whatever happened, the outcome wasn't terrible. But yet this man who had just recently dealt with the terrible death of his young toddler child was subjected to a so-called positive test because of a field drug test. And so again, I know that there are systems that work, but there are things that don't work, and there are things that work better than what we do have. And our work over the last few years is just engaging in the conversation because I think it was Matthew's point earlier, we're all people, but none of us are perfect. And so none of these systems that we create are perfect either, but how do we make sure that we're engaged in this continuous improvement that allows for the public safety that we all deserve and that we all frankly pay for?
Let me shift a little bit, and I'm going to ask you, Adam. A lot of our conversation revolved around the role of the community and how the community can be more involved in policing. And it sounded like this would also develop. It would also build on the public trust issue. I want to say more about that, and then I'm going to look to, again, Matt or Tamara to kind of to respond a little bit, because this is something that we're talking a lot about. We're hearing a lot about this, and how can we do this successfully?
Sure. I think what you're hearing from all of us is that trust is essential, and that better relationships between residents of the communities that police officers serve and the police is absolutely essential. And the fundamental question is how do we build it? Some of it is, I think, we can look to the past for better examples. And as Matt was saying, there were times when police officers were able to spend more time out in community building those relationships. It's complicated, but there are ways that we can do more to get more police officers out walking the beats. And there's some efforts underway in Chicago to do that. And the preliminary evidence is they're working really well, that the police officers who are participating in those programs are really enjoying it, and that the residents of the communities that those police officers are serving are really benefiting from it as well. There are also more structured ways that we can do that. I think it was Matt talked about the CAPS program. That was a structured program. It still exists within the police department for engaging with community in their regular CAPS meetings, people who turn out on a regular basis to engage with officers and police leadership in their district. There are some places where that CAPS program is working very well. There are also a lot of places where it isn't working very well, where there isn't the same level of meaningful communication, meaningful participation, or trust. So one of the things that that Desmon and the GAPA Coalition have been working on is to create new structures within police districts that will be sort of a permanent home for that kind of activity. Ways that would not be directed by the police department, but would engage meaningfully with the police department. Where on a regular basis, community residents and police officers could come together to talk about challenges in the community, to talk together about solutions, and to build trust. I think we need to be building structures both in the day-to-day experience of individual police officers, and more systemically within the district and across the city, that just create those opportunities at every turn for engagement and relationship building. It's really about systematizing it and structuring it so that it's part of everyone's regular experience.
Tamara, how open are the police to these kinds of efforts? And what are the pitfalls in your mind, if there are any?
Well, I would have to speak from my own personal opinion.
Yeah, of course.
The pitfalls. Well, I think let me start with the positives. The positives and something that I engage in is also the same thing that Matt said, is I get out of the car and I talk to people and I walk around and I do a foot patrol. And I think that is so key, and something that I practice where I work is to encourage the officers to get out of the car and walk down a block and engage with the people who live there. Allow the people in the community to see your face, see your name, and interact with you so they can really understand who you are, that you're there to help them. And then if, God forbid, something happens, that they know that they can trust the officers there because they've put a name to a face and a voice and have the understanding that it's more than just a uniform. So the community interaction with the police is so important. And I think I've lost a little focus here, but
it is. And how important are, for instance, bicycle patrols and things like that? I mean, does that make a difference as far as getting out in the community?
I believe it can when the weather, as of right now, we used to have the bike patrol unit that would bike the lakefront. Unfortunately, now they've been used to work on protests. However, we do have an opportunity to put officers on bikes within the districts. And I think that is definitely beneficial because it takes them out of the car. Not that any officer should be on their phone while they're at work, but it does make sure that the officers are engaged in the community because they have to look around, they have to look to see, and officers have definitely expressed an interest in being able to do that.
But how do you personally feel about people in the community engaging in critique, a critique of police work, whereas the police often will, judge particular police actions within itself, right, and offer and render a judgment, and so there's a greater call for communal representation in these kinds of cases.
I think anyone put in a position where their actions or thoughts are being questioned and challenged, any person would be challenged by that situation where you have the ability to separate yourself from the actions and look at it from someone else's perspective. And it takes a lot of courage to be able to do that. And I think as officers, when we can do that and we can openly listen to people and what they're actually saying and not be defensive, then that will lead to trust building. But it's difficult. Oftentimes, as I said before, we want to be seen as the heroes and seen as people. But sometimes I think officers are not given the benefit of the doubt, and because of that lack of trust, that there has to be something to break down the barriers to allow for open, honest discussion that, like we're having now, that can lead to the community building and the police community relationship that needs to happen for all of society to do better.
Right. I'm gonna throw some questions in that are coming in because I don't want to lose track of those. So Jane Lippo, I'm changing subjects, but I want to make sure we get some of the questions in. Please discuss the problem of no-knock searches, only one of many being the search of homes of Miss Young. Sometimes young children have guns pointed at them. So I'm going to ask for both sides of this conversation. Are no-knock searches essential for police work? I'm going to look to you, Matt.
So I didn't do a whole lot of search warrants. That wasn't one area that I got really into. However, from my experience, the purpose of the no-knock search warrant is when you wouldn't want the individual who's the target of the warrant, because they are violent, because they are armed, to have an opportunity to pull out a weapon and cause injury or death to the officers. So you'd want the element of surprise as much as possible. That's not every warrant. That would be in specific cases where you have intelligence that they are either heavily armed or have previously shown themselves to attack the police. So, of course, we had that case, Breonna Taylor, right, with the no-knock warrant. That's a tough one, honestly. I mean, the whole thing about, we would hope that with search warrants, with the judicial review, with the state's attorney's review prior to it happening, that we would be hitting that the officers would be hitting the right place, that it is the bad guy. But what happens when the information that was thought to be the best information was not? And now, as was pointed out, we're pointing guns at every occupant in the house. I don't. That certainly gives you reason to limit the amount of no-knock warrants. They should only be used in very narrow, in my eyes, in very narrow situations where you're absolutely certain of the propensity for violence there.
Desmond, what would you add to this?
I mean, I can agree with that. I think, having never been a police officer, I can imagine that there's probably a limited set of circumstances where this works. I think the problem with the Antoinette Young raid and so many others is that it seems as though there wasn't due diligence that was done. I think there were some things that came up in the sort of television version of the investigation that said that supervisor wasn't notified and some other things. So I think it's shortcuts. It's with any job. If you're a cook, a window maker, or a police officer, if you're taking shortcuts to do the work, that should be problematic. And if those shortcuts cost the city money, cost people lives, like, there should be an opportunity to revisit that and find out why these things keep happening in this way.
I'm gonna bring up an issue that we hear about quite a bit in the news, and we talked about this issue yesterday, but I want to make sure that we give it some of the time that it needs. Any of these issues, by the way, could make an entire session. And I appreciate the fact that we're sort of doing this in bullet points. Forgive but we're doing this in shorthand, I should say. But one of the questions that has received national attention is the whole issue of qualified immunity. And the way that, in our manner of reporting news or speaking on issues in non-nuanced ways, right? Qualified immunity feels like a get out of jail free card, that there's no consequence for improper action. And and of course, police unions have been called to task on this as well. So I guess I want to, and in our conversation yesterday, I think, Adam, you were talking about the nuance of this, and I think it's really important because this is an issue where I was seeing more agreement between you on this issue than I guess I would have expected based upon the news reportage. So, Adam, why don't you talk about this for a minute?
Sure. I apologize in advance because I probably need a little more than a minute.
I'll give you a few. Do your best.
Because it's a messy issue, and it's important to know what exactly qualified immunity is and where it comes from and what it's supposed to do. So the very quick history is qualified immunity sort of emerged out of post-Civil War law. So after the Civil War, the U.S. Constitution was amended to give some powerful new rights to Black people. State courts often refused to enforce those rights. So in 1871, Congress passed a law that said if a government official, like a police officer, for example, violates a person's constitutional rights, that person can sue the government and collect money for the constitutional violation. So if, for example, a police officer uses excessive force that violates the Constitution, the person who was the subject of that excessive force can bring a lawsuit, and they can get money. And that system has been in place now for 150 years. Starting in the late 1960s, the Supreme Court started to scale back the application of that law using this doctrine called qualified immunity. And for the last 50 years or so, the Supreme Court has kept on scaling back how people are able to enforce their rights against the government in federal court. In the late 60s, the Supreme Court created an exception. They said if a government actor, like a police officer, is acting in good faith, if they thought what they did was legal, they couldn't be held accountable. About 15 years after that, they changed, the Supreme Court changed it to say that a government official couldn't be held liable unless the constitutional violation, the constitutional principle that was at issue, was something that was clearly established. And more recently, the Supreme Court has said, for something to be clearly established, there basically has to be a case that looks pretty much exactly like that case. So lots and lots of cases are now getting thrown out where people are claiming constitutional violations, and courts are saying, that may be a bad thing, but it wasn't clearly established. And by clearly established, we mean we haven't heard a case yet that is exactly like this. So my issue is that the basic concept behind qualified immunity makes sense, that you shouldn't be holding people responsible for something that they didn't believe they were responsible for, if the law wasn't clear enough for them. But how courts have defined what it means for something to be clearly established, or what it takes for something to be clearly established, have resulted in a system now where it's almost impossible to use these laws to hold, for example, police officers, prison guards accountable. There's still other things that you can do, other accountability mechanisms within a police department. You can bring criminal charges, though that happens very rarely. So I understand, appreciate, and support the broad notion behind qualified immunity, that you want people treated fairly and not held to some unreasonable standard. But the standards that we've set, particularly recently, have made it virtually impossible to hold anyone accountable, even for egregiously awful behavior.
That was excellent. Even a rabbi could understand that, so thank you for that. Matt or Tamara or Desmond, would anybody want to say more about that?
Well, I would just like to add that from my understanding of qualified immunity, it is absolutely not carte blanche to violate things. So it's when the officer is acting in good faith. And it's not just police officers or prison guards. That was a great explanation of and the history. I didn't know that stuff. But it does protect all government officials, not just police officers, not just prison guards, all government officials who are acting within good faith. And then the challenge, as Adam pointed out, is how it's applied then and how it's developed over time and how case law has changed it. So that's all that it doesn't mean they have total immunity. Police officers get sued all the time. And there's damages that are assessed against your employer, and then punitive damages that are assessed directly against the officer. And the challenge is that officers are now feeling that if I'm out there doing my job and I'm trying to do it right, am I going to lose my house? Am I going to lose everything while trying to protect people? So that's just one of the.
Well, let me add to this, because I'm going to pick up on a question that Ruben Balak is asking. When it comes to the broad brush, one thing comes up a lot is officers protecting each other, the whole blue wall issue. So I think that there is a perception in the public that between, and again, these are the myths of this, between qualified immunity and the blue wall, officers are largely untouchable. Can I ask can we talk about this for a minute, about the reticence on the police part to call out bad behavior? Is that a myth? Is that real? And how should we understand that? Go ahead, Desmond.
I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Just recently did some work supporting Carrie Horn, who was a Buffalo police officer who about 15 years ago intervened when a gentleman was handcuffed and was being choked by another police officer. There's some dispute about how she went to intervene, but at the end of it, she was fired about 2 years short of receiving her pension, was sued by the officer that she tried to stop from choking this young man. I think somewhere around $500,000, and spent the last 15 years or so just really struggling. Right, this is a career that she had. She thought she was doing the right thing, and this is what happened to her. Her case was recently settled when two very important things happened. One, the city of Buffalo created a law called Carriel's Law, which has a duty to intervene statute built into it. And then the judge she filed a suit, or filed a claim, and was essentially reinstated in her role as a police officer, and is now able to retire and have access to that pension. If you ask her about the blue wall of silence, she would say that it exists completely, and that without this law, without this duty to intervene with penalties for officers who don't, that we would continue to have officers sort of perpetuate the image of the blue wall of silence that prevent officers from really stepping up when other cops do bad things.
I'm gonna direct this question to you, Tamara. When officers, this is from Beth Neiberg, when officers take training for de-escalation and other difficult topics, are they pass-fail, or are they just pass for attendance? In other words, is there an actual test, or and how serious are those tests?
This is all training. It's not necessarily in life. It's not a pass-fail type of test. The training is flowing. It's situational based. where you are put into a situation that's not real, but it mimics reality, to get you into that mindset, to understand the situation and be able to respond, and be challenged to respond in a way to de-escalate the situation, and to be able to be introspective and look back on the decisions that you've made in that scenario. Let me go back. It's scenario-based training, that you are put into a scenario where you're challenged to have to conduct yourself, and then you are critiqued on the way that you did that, and look for improvement on how you can do that in the future. So it's in my experience, it's not pass fail. I can't speak to everything. I'm not in charge of the training academy. That's their expertise. But what I can say from my own experience of having gone through some scenario-based training is that it's effective, because we are creatures of habit, and if you have not experienced something before, you may not know how you will, any person, how you will react to it. So part of scenario-based training is to put yourself in a situation where you are challenged, and then you can see how you react and then learn from there.
Thank you. Let's end, spend the last few minutes talking a bit about the foot pursuit policy. And really what I'm looking for is, do you feel like this is a positive or a negative? Is this going to make communities safer, or is it going to make communities less safe? So under the new policy, foot pursuits will be considered appropriate only when an officer has probable cause for an arrest or believes a subject is committing or is about to commit a crime. Officers will be discouraged from foot pursuits if the case at issue at hand is a minor traffic offense or a criminal offense, less than a Class A misdemeanor, provided that person does not pose an obvious threat to the community. Officers must be in continual communication with the subject and position themselves in such a way to reduce the opportunity for a foot chase. And finally, the officer must also ask themselves of the need to apprehend the subject is worth the risk of responding officers, the public, or the subject. So is this a help or a hindrance for police work? Adam, what do you think?
I'm reluctant to talk about the specific policy, which was just released yesterday, I think, and which I haven't read. Even though I went to and graduated from law school, which should qualify me to speak at great length about things that I know very little about, I think I'll decline here. Some of what you read sounds sort of big picture sensible, that we know foot pursuits are very dangerous. They're dangerous for everyone, including the officers who are involved. And so may make less sense for more minor incidents. And it sounds like some of that is reflected in the policy, but I really need to take a careful look at the policy, and haven't. I will talk a bit, because it's related. Rabbi, you referred earlier to the Adam Toledo killing, and mentioned some of what Desmond and I spoke about in the last session. So Adam Toledo was killed following a foot chase, and I think the issue that I tried to raise the last time we got together was that one of the things that I think is problematic is that when we assess uses of force, we generally assess the last second or the last several seconds of an incident that we should be looking at with a much wider lens. So in the case of Adam Toledo, so much of the discussion was about, at the precise moment the police officer in that case fired his gun, had Adam Toledo thrown a gun away? Was he still holding a gun? Were his hands up or not? They focus on these split seconds and what was happening then. I think we also need to look at those incidents and wind the clock back a bit and say, what happened 10 seconds before when that police officer got out of his car in a darkened alley, maybe setting the course for something that ended almost inevitably the way that it did. And so I think broadly, what a foot pursuit policy does is push on these kinds of questions, so that we're not just asking about that split second, often impossible decision about what should happen, but how can we, as best as possible, minimize the number of situations in which those kinds of terrible outcomes almost become inevitable? How can we reduce the number of times that police officers and civilians are in those situations where all choices are bad choices?
Matt, what would you say?
I thank you. First, I love Adam. He's an attorney and he answered like one. I haven't read it thoroughly, so I'm not going to tell you what, but then he did, to a degree. If I can just go off on one little tangent and then I'll get right back to it. Vehicle pursuits. It used to be wide open. And what would happen was terribly, terribly sad in some cases. And that's that we're chasing an individual in a hot car or whatever, or for a theft or some minor, not major crime, not a violent crime. And they run from the police and they go through lights and they wipe out and they kill a family of 4 as they broadside the car. Was the need for apprehension, did it outweigh the danger to the public? No, actually it was creating a greater danger. So I'm all for that. A little different with foot pursuits. A guy runs, he's not going to wipe out a family of 4. But the way that I look at the policy, and I haven't read the whole thing, this is going to be, it's going to cause great challenges for police officers, and it's going to give greater opportunity for, guess what? Most bad guys don't want to be arrested. So what are they going to do? They're going to flee. And if the police are told that they can't chase them, then that's going to cause problems for the police and advantages for the bad guys and for the community and bad things for the community. But let's take a quick look, and I know this might be painful, at the actual Adam Toledo case and look at what the new policy just said. So the first bullet point was foot pursuits will be considered appropriate only when an officer has probable cause for an arrest. Certainly, Adam Toledo had the gun at the beginning. There was probable cause for the arrest. So this policy would not have stopped, at least on that first bullet point, the Adam Toledo shooting. Second bullet point, officers will be discouraged from foot pursuits if the issue at hand is a minor traffic offense or criminal offense less than Class 8. Well, handgun is a felony, okay? Unlawful. So boom, those first 2 bullet points wouldn't have prevented the death of Adam Toledo. Third, officers must be in continual communication with the subject and position themselves in such a way as to reduce the opportunity. From what I understand, that too, in that case, would not have stopped the foot pursuit of Adam Toledo. The fourth point was officers must also ask themselves of the need to apprehend the subject is worth the risk to responding officers, the public, or the subject. He's armed with a handgun. On that point, has this pursuit done anything to prevent another 13-year-old with a gun from being shot by a police officer? And I don't think so. So is it going to solve anything that, is it meaningful here? And just from what I just went through in that particular case, it didn't prevent it. It wouldn't prevent the next one from happening. The issue at hand really is the actions of the subject. And what I would hope that people would understand is that in many senses, police are reactionary. We would love for every encounter to go smooth and clean. Most people, the majority of the population, the mere presence of a police officer is enough to get them to follow the rules of society, the rules that we all made. we call them laws, okay? The mere presence of the officer. Sometimes people need a little hint and verbal direction, the park is closed, you'll have to leave now, you can't drink here, okay? And they comply. Others, though, won't, and they need a little more, okay? And that's when you have to go hands-on. And anyhow, the whole thing that I'm getting at is, let's look at the actions of the offender as well. And could these things have been prevented?
Okay, I'm gonna give Desmond the last word.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Based on, so I did a little quick glance at what Class A misdemeanors are. And so like a UUW is a Class A misdemeanor, and there's some gray area. I just caution anything that says it's okay for a 13-year-old to have been shot by a police officer, right? I think about, the officer said, hey, stop, put down a gun, show me your hands. He did those things and was still shot. And I also just am familiar with, I don't know exactly what it's called, but there's a sort of confusion sort of thing that happens with a number of officers yelling commands at a person. And so if one officer is saying, put your hands up, the other one's saying, stick your hands out the car, right? Who does the subject respond to? And so this question about the responsibility for the subject to have, it's not about knowing he was 13 years old, it's still wrong, right? But I think that there's just a lot about this work that is dangerous for everyone. And how do we make sure that the decisions that we are making allow for not just public safety, but for the safety of the individuals involved? And so my concern about this foot chase policy, though I haven't spent a lot of time reading it, is, there was a task force that was created 2 years ago now, Adam, the Use of Force Task Force, which submitted 150 plus recommendations to the mayor. This task force was handpicked by the mayor and her people, and they accepted five recommendations from this task force. And I just find it hard to believe that of the 100 and some recommendations that were presented around how the use of force should be demonstrated in the community, that only 5 of those were accepted. So in order for us to have conversations like this that are robust, the conversations that are happening here aren't working to change the policies and the way that the police department interacts with the community. So I think that being able to have these sorts of spaces with the police department is where these conversations will bear the most fruit. And that's what Adam and I are seeking to do with the coalition that we're working with around the Civilian Oversight Commission, because it does sort of force us to have these really difficult conversations that, so the police officer didn't know that the 13-year-old was 13, all right, that's fine. But there are questions about Anthony Alvarez, right? It is legal in the city of Chicago to carry a handgun. So what was that stop about? And so to Matthew's point earlier about the way that the media tells bits and pieces of the information to be provocative, I think what is more important is that there's enough anecdotal evidence about the way the system of policing has affected people in the community that we can take some time, look at that evidence, and try to figure out, again, a system that is much safer for all people involved.
On that note, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank you, Tamara, you, Matt, Adam, and Desmond. This has been a remarkable conversation, and all of us are indebted to you, to each of you, for the work that you do, but also the tenor of this conversation. It was refreshing to be able to really have a thoughtful conversation where we were not saying who was right and who was wrong, but to be able to listen to each other in order to really expand our thinking. So we're indebted to each of you. I thank Amy Karp for setting this up, and I wish everybody a good night. Thank you.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. I'll
you.
come back anytime you want me.
Okay.
Thanks, Tamara.
I hope I don't make you
Thank
sorry,
you.
but we will. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Rabbi. Appreciate you all.
Have a good night, all.
Good night.
Night.